Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First of all, I would like to welcome all of you to this fifth webinar in a series of webinars held by Emirates Policy Center in Abu Dhabi to foresee the consequences of coronavirus crisis on the world and in the region. This webinar deals with political and economic challenges facing Iran and its future shifts in post-corona period. Iran was one of the first Middle Eastern countries to be hit by coronavirus and is considered now as one of the most affected nations in the region and the world by the pandemic. According to figures by Iranian authorities, the number of confirmed cases has reached more than 150,000 and about 8,000 deaths. Two factors have contributed in enhancing frustration and desperation among the Iranian people. First, the Iranian regime mismanagement of the coronavirus crisis that even led many Iranians to believe that the regime has contributed to the spread of the pandemic inside and outside the country due to the regime unburdened ideological policies. Internally, by holding the parliamentary election despite the pandemic, and externally by continuing to operate Mahan air flights carrying passengers infected with a coronavirus without applying any health measure. Second, the coronavirus crisis has increased the suffering of the Iranian people, who are already suffering from the American economic sanctions. Iranian elites, notably former President Mohammad Khatami, have warned against the outbreak of violence in Iran in response to the state of desperation experienced by Iranians under the current regime. In the light of internal health, social, and even political challenges due to the coronavirus crisis and the country's collapsing economy, Iran's foreign policy seems to have been affected under these severe conditions. Observers have recently noticed a decline in Tehran influence, particularly in both Iraq and Syria. To analyze comprehensive consequences of this crisis that the Islamic Republic of Iran facing these days, we hold this webinar, in which we host a select of experts and specialists in the Iran affairs. Those include Dr. Alice Vatanka, Director of Iran Program and Senior Fellow at Middle East Institute in Washington, with a particular focus on Iran domestic and regional policies, and Dr. Jawad Salehi Isfahani, Professor of Economics at Virginia Tech in the US and non-resident Senior Fellow at Brookings Institution, whose research focuses on the economics of Iran and the Middle East. And later, Dr. Mahdi Khalaji will join us, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, whose interests are focused on Shia politics in the Middle East. I would like to welcome our speakers for today and thank them for accepting our invitation to participate in this event. I would also like to welcome all viewers who watch this webinar on EPC's account on various social media platforms and the Center's YouTube channel via Zoom application. Before I give the floor to the speakers, I would like to draw the attention of Arab viewers that they can listen to the Arabic interpretation of the discussion by clicking on the icon down the screen, interpretation icon, and choosing French channel. At first, I would like to ask every speaker to give us an initial intervention for 3 minutes on the topic of our today discussion. And I wish to start with Dr. Alex Vatanka. Thank you. Dr. Alex.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Ebtisam. It's great to be back and great to have the opportunity to come back to another EPC event. I always look forward to these events, and I look forward to my next visit to Abu Dhabi, hopefully soon. So Dr. Ebtisam, I'm going to quickly spend my 3-4 minutes, go through some key points here to sort of lay out the discussion for today. I wanted to first answer the following question: whether the coronavirus crisis has impacted Iran's political model, the Islamic Republic model, since this crisis erupted. And I frankly don't see any political crisis related to coronavirus or the COVID-19 crisis. Iran simply, at this point now, a few months into this crisis, is just another country hit by the virus. It got a lot of the headlines early on because it was one of the earliest countries to be hit badly. But at this point, I think certainly the political aspect of this crisis in Iran doesn't seem to be any greater than a lot of other similar countries. There is no doubt that the authorities in Tehran made some bad decisions early on. For example, they held elections in February for the Majlis, which, in retrospect should have never been held. But clearly the authorities put the sort of quest for legitimacy above public health and had these elections when in fact most people didn't know what danger they were in when they were going to those ballot boxes and those public places to cast their votes, which incidentally turned out to be elections with the lowest participation in memory. You've had opportunities inside the ranks of the regime to use the COVID-19 crisis to go after each other. Early on, we saw Revolutionary Guards wanted to be the sort of vanguard of public health. Suddenly, for a moment, they decided that that's what they wanted to focus on. You had the Revolutionary Guards putting out, hospital beds in the countryside, doing all sorts of things to deal with the health crisis. They looked at it very much as a security issue as well. If you recall, there was a group of French doctors that came in with the blessing of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, but once they were in Iran, the Revolutionary Guards told them to go away, clearly sending a signal that they wanted to have a tight control over how to deal with the COVID-19 crisis. Finally, in terms of the politics of it, let's look at Ayatollah Khamenei, the man who obviously matters more than anyone else. And what has Ayatollah Khamenei done for the last 6 months? Has there been any sign of him kind of, if you will, look back and say, maybe we should change some of our approach to policy? And the answer to that is no. From 2nd of January, with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, to the shooting down of the Ukrainian airliner, to the unfolding of COVID-19 crisis, Ayatollah Khamenei has stayed the course. He seems to believe that the best way forward is to sort of dig in, if you will, and just go at it and not make any concessions, certainly not to the opponents of the regime. And he does that for one simple reason. He will be 81 years old next month. He has the issue of succession in his mind. And clearly what Khamenei is doing is to prepare the ground for an orderly succession. He doesn't just want an orderly succession the way it happened back in 1989. He's also very much interested in making sure someone of his ideological camp becomes the person that will take over from him whenever he leaves the stage. President Rouhani, frankly, I hate to say this because I don't want to sort of make a political point out of it, but it's irrelevant. I mean, there's nothing left for Rouhani to do. He's got 15 months left in office. To me, it seems he just wants to survive at this point and not embarrass himself. And he will get that. There'll be no attempt to impeach him, as some people have speculated. He will have his stay, 15 more months in the presidential palace, but don't expect anything big in terms of bold politics from this Iranian president. I also have to say hardliners in Tehran are not united, but they do tend to become united when they get the order from the office of the supreme leader in terms of which way to go. And last time we saw that was at the choosing of the next or the current speaker of the Majlis, Mohammad Baqir Qalibaf. Qalibaf had been in the running for a couple of months. He didn't necessarily have more than 50 or so votes in the 290 Majlis, but at the end he got 230 votes. And he put aside some of the other hardline candidates and including people who are close to former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. That tells me that Khamenei has a pretty good grip. He obviously is in charge of his own office, the office of the Supreme Leader. He has the loyalty of the generals and the Revolutionary Guards. He has a new person, relatively new, in the shape of Ibrahim Raisi in the judiciary. Now he controls the Majlis, and the president is weak. So anybody who talks about moderation in Iran today and the idea of gradual reform, you really have to look very hard to see any chance of this system being able to reform itself. For the simple reason that Ayatollah Khamenei does not want to see gradual change. He wants change that he believes will benefit him and his legacy. In terms of quickly, a second question I had, and I'll be quick because I'm sure I've already run over my 3 minutes, but forgive me, on US sanctions and Tehran's policies and whether the crackdown will continue, crackdown on protesters. Obviously, Dr. Esfahani will speak about the economic conditions and far better than I will, but just looking at it from sort of a general, broad point of view, you know, President Rouhani says himself that the sanctions since 2018 have cost the country 200 billion. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's a figure he's put out there. 200 billion in sanctions plus the sudden drop in the price of oil. You can just imagine how little money is available right now. And to give you a sense of how little money they have available, the government of Iran is looking to raise 3 billion roughly from privatization in this fiscal year. And if I get my number right, they got 284 million, which is 10 times less last year. It shows you how desperate the authorities are to raise money by selling public assets to raise funds, to maintain some social harmony in society that obviously in a state like Iran, oil money has always been able to satisfy enough people that regime can politically feel confident. They've asked for a $5 million loan from IMF. They haven't gotten it yet, doubtful they will get it. They asked for a $2 billion loan from Russia. The Russians haven't given it to them either. These things all to me speak of a state that is in need of funds. But I also make one final point about economics. It's really hard to figure out exactly what's going on. Love to hear what Javad has to say about this. But I mean, the latest figures, for example, in terms of oil revenue, the Rouhani government says they got $9 billion from oil revenue last year. The central bank governor says they got 21 billion. There's a big difference here. And who speaks the truth? Some of these figures are deliberately put out to confuse the outside world, particularly the United States. Iran is now in the business of trying to avoid being sanctioned and not being, if you will, discovered as it engages in trade. But nonetheless, I think the question of who is running the show becomes a paramount important question. I'm speaking specifically on economic policy. The last 6 months, we haven't seen social unrest tied to economic conditions or political conditions. I think that doesn't necessarily mean all those protesters from 2017 or 2018 have gone away or will never return. I think they will return. The question is just when. But at the same time, you can almost be assured that the authorities are ready to deal with whoever comes out in the streets if they come back again, which I'm sure they will. And Dr. Ebtisam, 2 quick points, and then I'll leave it at that. We can get into the region later. On China and Russia, I just want to say this. The Chinese and the Russians are in a good position as far as Iran is concerned. Iran has isolated itself.
The question Q&A?
Sure, we can do that. Yeah, let me stop there. That's absolutely fine.
Thank you. Dr. Salehi, please.
Yes, hi. I'm going to share my screen and show a few slides. And that's because I want to establish some common knowledge about where I'm coming from using economic data. I have something also about the severity of the COVID crisis. And after that, we can talk about other things during the question and answer. I'm assuming that you're able to see this presentation now I have. So the first graph on the left is about the number of cases per million in Iran and Turkey. I'm comparing Iran with Turkey because it's a neighboring country, similar population, but a more advanced economy. And as you both correctly observed, Dr. Ndazan and Alex, that Iran had a very bad case with the corona cases, and this is this blue line here. You see a big rise in late March as a result of the delay in doing stay at home or controlling travel and so on. But what's interesting is that actually Turkey, which came after Iran and should have learned the lesson, they had a bigger rise in the number of cases per million. What is interesting about Iran is that after it declines for about a month, and this is mainly a point about Iran's economy, how fragile it is. They cannot hold the quarantine for much longer, so they let go. As a result, you see here the number of cases shooting up back to the peak. And this is a lesson for any country that is thinking of relaxing the rules. I'm not saying this was a bad policy, because even in the US, in most European countries, now the pendulum has shifted in the direction of preserving the economy as opposed to preserving health. We don't know where this is going. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, that is the number of deaths. That hasn't shot up as much. By the way, Iran is looking worse for a while than Turkey. Turkey probably has a better healthcare system. Iranians had a fairly high death rate from the infections. And now it's sort of stabilized, but it's possible it will go up. So maybe the health crisis will become more severe, but we don't know. Let me go to this next slide. If you think in terms of how the Iranians are managing the COVID shock, as I said just a minute ago, they seem to now be favoring preserving the economy as opposed to keeping cases and fatalities low. So they have basically free back to work with very few limitations, although people are still practicing social distancing, but jobs are back, people are going back to work. And I think Iran has an unusually high risk on the economic side compared to European countries, because it has a very large informal sector. About 3/4 of Iranian workers work in enterprises with fewer than 5 workers. These are partially unregistered. It's very hard to reach them. If they disintegrate, it's very hard to put them back on. So maybe the government made the right decision in allowing people to go back to work, because the social impact, the economic impact would have been much larger than in countries where you can send checks, you can have paycheck protection programs, and so on. Finally, you should know that Iran, in the case of Iran, for the last, I guess, 10 years, the economy has been on the front burner of the confrontation between the United States and Iran. And therefore, it is not something like in France or UK, that if your economy is faltering, that the whole state is in peril, or the political economy is in peril. In Iran, the economy has taken a lot more of a political role, and therefore that might be why they are favoring that over public health at this point. In terms of sanctions, I'm moving on to the economy. There is no question that has been major damage from sanctions. But what people, especially people in Washington, where Alex works, have failed to recognize is that economic collapse is a completely different animal than economic decline. Iran's economy is kind of misunderstood. It seems to observers from outside as being overly dependent on oil. It actually is not that dependent on oil, and I'm going to show you why. The economy was growing robustly until 2011 under the same regime, the same management, and with the same level of corruption that people complain about all the time. And what we notice is that the decline began with the sanctions. And that is why the government is optimistic that if they make a deal in the next 2 to 3 years, the growth will be resumed again, with the same level of mismanagement and corruption that's common to many developing countries. What has been very critical in the case of Iran is the ability to let the rial to depreciate, Iran's currency. And as a result, put imported goods at a disadvantage relative to domestic goods. And that has been a positive impetus on Iran's economy. And in terms of the Iranian parlance, that's pretty much like the model of resistance economy that the supreme leader has been promoting, an economy that's less dependent on import and more dependent on local production. And that means that Rouhani's reach for globalization is pretty much now dead because the adjustment to sanctions has perhaps as a byproduct promoted the resistance economy relative to the globalized economy that Rouhani has been promoting. If you look at this graph here on the right, it tells you a very interesting story that most people don't know because they look at various kind of data, the data they like. Iran's economy and Turkish economy grew for 2 decades, 1990s and 2000s, pretty much at par. So this is an economy that's doing okay by global standards, global developing country standards. And then the big change comes after 2010 when sanctions tighten. You see a big drop, and right now you probably are down here because of sanctions and so on. And you can see that Turkish economy that continued its global connections grew very rapidly in the last 10 years. The oil price collapse has not had a big impact on Iran as big as it has had on the countries in the southern part of the Persian Gulf. And the reason is that Iran has a fairly complex economy, and it has been able to take advantage of the cheaper rial, or if you like, more expensive foreign currency, to push resources towards domestic production. To get the sense of how bad the situation is financially, you have to realize that Iran, the last peak of its oil exports was $120 billion in 2011. And last year is somewhere probably between 10 and 20. This year is definitely below 10. And the point that Alex mentioned about 9 and 20, the discrepancy, it could be because the government doesn't take all the money from oil exports. Some goes to the oil ministry, some goes to another account called National Savings Account, and then some goes to the budget. Maybe Rouhani's minister was talking about the number they were able to put their hands on, which was $9 billion last year. Anyway, it's a very small amount. So the government is in dire financial state, and that's why, again, as Alex mentioned, it's been resorting to heavy sale of real and financial assets, 3 times as much as in 2019. We'll see how successful it has been. It's just started selling those assets on Tehran's stock exchange. The government also has a very heavy burden of social protection. You know, it's still a revolutionary government. The government has promised to protect the poor. So it has a very popular cash transfer program that pays $25. These are all in PPP dollars per person per month to every individual, about 12% of median expenditures, which is a reasonable amount. People are able to get cash advance for $330 if they want to borrow against that transfer to manage the current worst situation they are in. They're also eligible to get one-time transfers. And finally, this big program that's coming, and it's probably in terms of impact similar to the cash transfer program that Ahmadinejad introduced in 2011, and that is the program of justice shares, also initiated by Ahmadinejad. It's very interesting. The 2 programs that are coming to help Rouhani now are programs that were initiated by Ahmadinejad. The justice shares gave 49 million individuals assets which basically shares to public enterprises. And now they are allowed to sell them or keep them and manage them. And if they sell them, they're worth about $3,000 to $5,000, which is a big chunk of change for poor people. I'm going to stop here and look forward to your questions. And I will stop the share.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Salehi. Before I go to Q&A, I would also again repeat for the Arab viewers that they can listen to the interpretation by clicking on the interpretation icon down on the screen and choosing French language. They will be able to hear the Arabic translation. Well, Alex, I will start with a question for you. The revolution wing in the Iranian regime has built regional influence, while the state's role in foreign policy remains servant to this influence or confined to diplomatic details. So, will the American sanction and consequences of coronavirus lead Iran to act as a state and stop acting as a cause?
You know, right now, I think I would lean towards describing it still as heavily committed to the sort of, as you put it, the cause. You know, in terms of how that manifests itself, it could be anything from saying to the United States to watch out in the waters of the Persian Gulf, to Iran sending a 5-tanker convoy to Venezuela. I mean, it manifests itself in different ways. In other words, this desire to stand up to the United States is still very much alive in good part of the in the Iranian regime or state, which to me is basically what you described. They're the people with a cause as opposed to looking for the national interest. Now, this schism has been there for a long time. I mean, you can go back to the middle of the Iran-Iraq war, where you had a schism between people who were saying at the time, look, we've got to look after number one. Number one is Iran, the Iranian people, forget about the region, bring this war with Saddam to an end, and so on. But from my perspective, from my personal perspective, unfortunately, the revolutionary wing is carrying the day right now. I mean, I, in my remarks, talked about what Ayatollah Khamenei said recently. He was talking about, in Farsi, a government of the Hezbollahis, the Hezbollah meaning the believers in the system. It's a code for the ones who support him, as opposed to so-called moderates. This is his line of thinking. He might have come to this conclusion because of, you know, years of upsets and failures, or he might have grievances by, you know, say, the United States and others. But the reality is, he is at the end of his life, or nearing his end of his life, he is a revolutionary, and he wants that to be his legacy. That is how I see it. I don't see a, you know, if I compare Khamenei to, say, someone like, if everybody remembers him, Rafsanjani, Hashemi Rafsanjani. Hashemi Rafsanjani was the opposite of Khamenei. He had reached a different set of conclusions. Rouhani is closest to someone like Rafsanjani, and he wants to take Iran in a different direction. And I think Javad was talking about, you know, Rouhani doesn't have an opportunity now to go for a global, you know, marketplace to sell Iran as a product. He tried. If you remember, in January of 2014, one of the first visits he made was to Davos in Switzerland. And people took him seriously. Western businesses certainly took him seriously. But when he went home, he then had to fight the fight in Tehran about what kind of Iran do we want. And he never won. He never won. And Rouhani has never wanted to fight that fight directly with Khamenei. And I would say Mahmoud Ahmadinejad as president didn't do it either. Certainly Mohammad Khatami didn't do it either. So it's, unfortunately, this is a very much a live issue. This is very much a live issue. And let me say this, Dr. Ibtisam, and I'll stop. The danger here is this. This schism that I just described about what Iran ought to be, a nation state looking after itself and kind of stay home type of thing, versus being a cause and go out there and try and spread its message, if you will. This as I said, one, it's not a new fight, it's a very old fight. But for a long time, including the election of Rouhani in 2013 and his re-election in 2017, the people who voted for him believed he might be different. He might be able to actually make a difference. He has failed. In fact, you could say his 8-year presidency has been one of the worst presidencies in terms of producing results, And this leaves your average young, angry Iranian with, do I want another revolution like my dad or granddad, grandma did? Or should I still believe in the ideal or in the promise of gradual change? As we've seen with protests in Iran, fewer and fewer people seem to believe that, and certainly among the younger generation, that gradual change is possible. And that takes us in the direction of a potential political upheaval down the road. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Alex. That was excellent. Dr. Salehi, will the Iranian regime be forced to adjust or change its existing economic model in light of the American sanctions and the local and global implication of the coronavirus crisis?
That's a good question. Let me try to answer it by piggybacking on the points that Alex was making. I think it's absolutely correct that from the beginning, the Islamic Revolution has been two things. It has been a revolutionary state, which, like all revolutionary states, keep going on and on and on. If you like, the Soviet Union for decades was still trying to export the revolution, nearly until it fell. And it's also been a development state. Even at the birth of the revolution, the messages that were coming from the revolution's leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, was that we're going to make your life better, and we're going to bring Islam as a revolutionary principle into the country. And people have been grappling with what is Iranian people inside Iran have been grappling, which is the real revolution. Is it the revolution that's going to deliver a better life for average Iranian, or is it going to make a revolution that's going to make Shia Islam paramount in the region? And Iran has an imperfect way of getting to a realization of what people really want. If you notice, in every election, it seems like the development state wins. Rafsanjani, as Alex mentioned, he was the development president, and that's exactly the name they called him in Iran, Sardar Sazandagi, reconstruction general. And Khatami came with a similar message. Ahmadinejad came with the opposite message at the beginning, but very quickly, all his attention went into cash transfers, not always policies that economists would recommend, but he was an economic president, a development president as well, even though he may have failed. Although oil price increase in the 2000s came to his rescue, and he had a very successful presidency, if you like, on the back of the oil price increase, which I showed in my graph. And now Rouhani was going to be a repeat of Rafsanjani, a development president as well. But then the sanctions came and he was unable to deliver. What will Iran do in the face of intensified sanctions? First of all, sanctions may not remain very intensive for very long, especially if Democrats win in November. So I'm sure the Iranian state is looking to that possibility and trying to reach a negotiation table from a point of strength. So that's what they're really looking forward is not showing weakness until there is a reasonable person at the other side of the table who is willing to negotiate. As most Iranians are now convinced, the team of Pompeo and Trump are not the people to negotiate with. That's why they're taking a very radical posture at the moment. I don't think sanctions are that strong to get the revolutionary state to change its policies. And as I indicated in my slides, the resistance economy, which has been the model of the development state that's also revolutionary at the same time. So there's kind of a fusion of the two strategies into one. That has actually won as a result of sanctions. So I don't see any reason why the revolutionaries would want to go back now and say, sorry, we were wrong. There's no resistance economy. Because of sanctions, we're going to go for globalization. We're going to submit to the 12 points that Pompeo outlined, which was basically capitulation. So that's, I think, my answer to that question.
Thank you. Great. Alex. The revolution, now it seems that you are both oppose the impact of the American sanctions. So now, in the light of the consequences of the US sanctions and coronavirus crisis, can the Iranian regime build a new balance to manage internal pressure and external influence? Alex?
Yeah, Dr. Ibtisam, I think, that's probably what they're going to try and do for now. There are a couple of things out there that gives them hope. Javad was talking about the elections here in this country in November. Certainly, if you listen to the Biden campaign, there are enough people in there who are talking about a return to the 2015 nuclear agreement, the so-called JCPOA. As soon as Iran is back in compliance, meaning, reduces number of centrifuges, reduces how much it enriches and all the rest of it, then the Biden presidency, if there is to be a Biden presidency, they're going to be back in business, and that's a hopeful sign for the Iranians. On the sidelines, Iran, or at least a good part of the regime, has for a long time reassured itself that friends, meaning Russia and China, will keep it alive somehow. The record there is very mixed. The data showed that Chinese trade with Iran has declined massively, and it's not just because of COVID-19 and the drop in oil demand. It seems to be much bigger than that. And I think when I see Iranian sentiment on China, of course, China is a rising power. Nobody doubts it. You've got to deal with China. This is the reality of the world that we live in, and we should welcome it, embrace it, and all the rest of it. And that's true in Iran as well. But there is at the same time a sense that China is taking Iran for granted, that China is playing this card. Nonetheless, what I'm trying to get at is you can have these hopes, a Biden presidency or China and Russia will help you. But I think in the long term, this is only a delaying tactic. You've got to make a decision with your own people before you reach a conclusion about the world. And the people of Iran, I think every evidence suggests, want to be in a different path. They want to go in a different direction as a people, as a country. You cannot be a revolutionary state and export a revolution that has failed at home. I hear what Javad is saying about 41 years of development, and some of that is absolutely true. And we saw the comparisons to Turkey. But you know where Iranians go and buy property today? Turkey. They don't go buy, what I'm saying is it's not just about economics and development. It's about what kind of a life you want to have. And there's a massive gap between the vision of the revolutionaries, folks like Qasem Soleimani, and the generals and the Revolutionary Guards, and then your average Iranian, certainly the young. So the revolution of Iran happened in 1979 when the Cold War was going on. Marxism was a big theory at the time. And a lot of the things that Islamic Republic does essentially is Marxist. I mean, there's it's essentially about the collective approach to economy and all the rest of it. I don't know how long you can keep going at this pace. I am being one of the ones who are looking at what could, for example, the Revolutionary Guards do to preserve its political power after Khamenei, to remain relevant, to not be the big boogeyman for everyone in Iran. And one thing is sure, their Islamism is not going to do it for them. Islamism and militant Islamism works for Revolutionary Guards in Iraq and in Syria and in Lebanon and Yemen. It doesn't work in Iran. It will not save the day for them. So they have to think how are they going to reinvent themselves. Certainly the day Khamenei dies, they need to come up with something that has a bit of a more appeal to it than what, going to Syria to defend the holy shrines. That slogan's not going to rally the nation around them anymore.
Thank you, Alex. Again, I will repeat for the Arab viewer. أعزائي المتابعين العرب، بإمكانكم متابعة هذه الندوة الافتراضية بالضغط على زر في أسفل الشاشة المكتوب عليه interpretation واختيار French language للسماع الترجمة باللغة العربية. Dr. Salehi, can the Iranian regime benefit from non-oil resources to run the economy and overcome the poverty and unemployment problems as part of the ramifications of the American sanctions and the coronavirus pandemic?
That's a good question. The only part I would change in your question is Iranian government running the economy. And this is a point I like to make because of what Alex said about following Marxism. Iran's economy is a market-based economy. There are millions of employers every day, hiring people, firing people, producing. I think it's very good, very important to understand Iran not as a country run in micro detail by a state, by a government, but lots of people doing things, families training their boys and girls and people looking for jobs. So that's the point number one. Whether the government can help these people solve their problem, which is a problem that we see all over the region, unemployment of young people, that's a very good question. And at this point, actually, their policies has a better promise of creating employment, because if you look at the past couple of years under maximum pressure, whereas output has declined, especially in the oil sector, employment has grown. Again, the reason is simple, because producing for the market using Iranian workers is much more profitable than it used to be. If you like, Iranians consumed a lot of things produced by Chinese workers a couple of years ago. That happens when you have a lot of oil. People don't necessarily look to buy national goods. They buy the best stuff, and the best stuff is coming from abroad. So sanctions have done, in some sense, an unwitting, unintended favor to people who were selling or proposing the resistance economy, closing down Iran to trade. And I think on just the employment, they have the potential to do better than Ahmadinejad did, for example, when he opened the spigots of all the imports came. Employment growth under Ahmadinejad was really disastrous. It was about 14,000 new jobs per year. Why? Because everything was coming from abroad. What is the number of jobs being created now? About 500,000. That's because Iranians go to work, they are trained, they're educated, they see the needs, they see the market benefits and go for it. Sanctions place a serious impediment on this process, however, because the main benefit of devaluation and giving up oil is not to just produce for local market, but also to export shoes, shirts, petrochemicals, goods like that. Sanctions prevent this part. Sanctions don't prevent Iranian producers producing for the domestic market, but they prevent Iranians producing for the neighboring markets, where sanctions are not that influential. Goods move across the Iraqi border, move across the Afghani border. There's stuff moving towards the UAE. So if sanctions were removed and oil was not part of the removal of sanctions, Iran would actually take off. That's the irony. If Iranians wanted to go back to the table, they could give up oil as a bargaining chip to say, okay, oil market is in a bad shape. And if we start producing 2 more million barrels per day, that's going to dampen the price. What do we do without that? why don't you just let us use the global financial system? That's all they need to be able to move money around. So when they sell something in Iraq, they don't have to bring a suitcase of cash or gold, or bring gold back from Venezuela when they sell them oil. They can just do an electronic money transfer. So yeah, the potential is there, but they really need some sanctions relief in order to take full benefit of the new employment machine that has been unleashed thanks to the more expensive foreign currency.
Thank you, Dr. Saleh. Dr. Alex, in the light of the consequences of US sanctions and coronavirus crisis, will the Iranian regime will be able to continue with its policy containing and oppressing social protest movements? Will Iran be able to continue with its rentier economy under this severe situation?
You know, Dr. Ibtisam, we just, I think you've heard from me and from Javad that money is certainly less available than before. So we talk about rentier state. If I understand the definition of that, then no, it's going to be harder. It's going to be harder. There'll be pockets that, pockets in society that will, even if they weren't political before, will be politicized. Because once you start having to face your family at night and don't have what it is to feed them, then whether you want it or not, you become political. You become political. In fact, you could make the argument that that's the kind of drive that happened, or at least was part of the momentum that led to the 1979 revolution by the urban poor, who felt left behind, they were disconnected. And I wouldn't say, you can't compare the two, but certainly there are enough people in Iran today that feel that they're left behind. And that's what I was trying to get to. And to your question earlier about, are you a nation state or a cause? You know, at the end of Ramadan this year, Ayatollah Khamenei talked about the holy struggle. It wasn't a holy struggle for economic resistance or making jobs. You know, it's wonderful that Iran produces 500,000 jobs a year. It's wonderful that the cars are getting better, sturdier, all the rest of it. But Khamenei's holy struggle was against Israel and America. And if they want to join the financial market, you don't need, you know, much of an education, I guess, to know that that's not going to happen. Not now, not anytime soon. It takes us to a simple question that, you know, what is it you want? If it is job creation you want, stability at home you want, survival for the regime that you want, then you're going to cut deals. Now, you could say, well, they did in 2015 cut a deal, and it was the Americans who walked away. But that's water under the bridge. And looking ahead, the social protests that we're talking about, well, we know rentier state is under pressure. And we know Iran is aging as a society, but there are enough young people still that need jobs who'll come out if they have to. And on top of that, you got a small elite that are running Iran. I hear what Javad says about Iran as a place of, you know, it's a market economy of sorts. It is, and it isn't. It isn't because you don't really have law and order in Iran. To me, the concept of market economy has on the other side of it the kind of things that come with a liberal democracy, accountability, transparency. Those are missing in Iran. You know, there are cases after cases of billions of dollars disappearing. Nobody knows, or actually they do know, they don't dare say it because it's somehow linked to the powerful political actors. What I'm trying to say, I guess, in all these things is you got a restless population that are feeling detached from the rest of the state. Whatever good they have done the last 41 years, today, as of June 2020, if you had a referendum in Iran about this system, would you vote for it or not? I have no doubt people would vote it out. And it's not because, you know, they personally have a grudge against Khamenei, or it's because it's not delivering. It's simply not delivering. And you don't have to take my word for it. I mean, let me give you an example. An individual by the name of Heshmatullah Falahat Pishe, he's got a difficult name, but he used to be, up until recently, the head of the foreign policy committee in the Iranian Majlis. He was a conservative 20 years ago. He grew up on the border with Iraq, had fought the Iraqis. He wasn't a reformist. He wasn't a Javad Zarif type of guy. He was on national media just recently, and he said, you know, what happened to our $20 to $30 billion in Syria? We want that money back. We want that here. He comes from a region that was struck by earthquake a couple of years ago, and they still haven't engaged in reconstruction. I don't want to bore you, Dr. Ebtissam, because I think you know all the details, but what I'm trying to say is this, you know, Revolution Guard sending off a missile into atmosphere, going to capture headlines for a day or two, but people are going to go back and they're still going to recognize that people around them in the world are doing better. And that is basically what the Islamic Republic has to confront. I'll stop there.
No, I know this, but I think some of the viewers, they don't know this. Now, I have a question for both of you, but I will start with Dr. Salihan. How can the consequences of the US sanctions and coronavirus crisis affect Iran's nuclear options?
It's a very good question. It's outside my expertise, but let me just say one thing. If, as I understand it, the government, the state now has become unified on the issue of jobs, if they're serious, sacrificing the nuclear industry in order to gain access to financial markets would be a very good deal for them. Nuclear industry does not employ many people, nor does, for example, oil and petrochemicals. What they need is to engage the 27 million people who work in Iran every day in various enterprises, some owned by the government, some not owned by the government. And I think it's that equation that really matters. And I'm more optimistic than Alex is, and more optimistic than a lot of people in Washington, that the government is serious about economic development. It does not see itself as a dead end. It does not see itself dealing with a completely hostile population as wishful thinkers in Washington do. And therefore, to preserve the gains from the revolution, and let me remind everyone that Iran has a human development index that's about the same as Turkey's, and is a little better than Mexico. So when you are able to provide education and health, longevity, and so on for your population, you don't throw all that for a nuclear industry. You're very careful. And I think they are. Also, let me remind you, and Alex mentioned that Ayatollah Khamenei is very focused on the revolutionary state. For the last several years, he has named every new Iranian year a year of production, just changes the adjective. This last year, in March 21, when Corona was coming and sanctions were very high, he designated the Iranian year 1399 as the year of upsurge in production. That's not the language of a revolutionary. I think the neighboring countries, United States, Europeans would do well to drop these assumptions that this is a completely revolutionary state, will stop at nothing, and therefore you have to choke it to death until you get change in behavior. Change in behavior can come from a reasonable deal, not a capitulation. And that's what Obama offered Iran. And I think Iran was on the right track. And you just have to have faith that Iranian public want to live in peace in the region. And eventually they will come to convince their leaders that that's the way the revolution should go. Threatening the revolutionaries is counterproductive.
You're muted, Dr. Ebtissam. But if that's me, I'll go ahead. There you go. Yeah, if I may very quickly look on Javad's point, I wish, and I'm not saying he's not sincere, Khamenei, when he wants jobs, but I want to go a couple of levels above that and then say, why is it that why is it that it has taken 7 years for him to focus on job creation? Because for 7 years, he's failed to create jobs. And you have to ask yourself the question, why are we failing? And, you know, Iran basically wants to be a normal economy, go out there, be a normal state, have access to everything, and then run around in the region and be the sort of mothership, a bunch of paramilitary groups in Iraq and Syria and so on. There is a contradiction here, for good or bad. I'm not going to say bad things about the paramilitaries. Let's just say heroes. But the fact is, they're not heroes for the Americans. They're not heroes for the Israelis. They're not heroes for the vast majority of Europeans. They're not heroes for the vast majority of people in the Gulf states. That's a problem. You've got to choose. And all these things we're talking about, we're not really tackling what is at the heart of this. What kind of a state is it going to be? People, you know, when we talk about, again, another point that Javad mentioned, I totally agree. Have a nuclear program, but have it in a way that doesn't scare your neighboring states, right? Now, this is not limited to Iran. You know, I always, when I go on Persian TV, I say, what is it about Pakistan's nuclear program that they got away with it? Nobody talks about Pakistan's, whatever, 100+ nuclear warheads today. What is it about Iran that makes it stand out? It's the rhetoric. It's all the shouting that they do. It's uncertainty about what it is they want to do in the region. And it goes back to what Khomeini started in 1979. Everybody else is kind of rotten and we're going to change everything. And that fear is still there. And the Islamic Republic needs to tackle that head on, and they're not doing it. In fact, they play with it to this day. I just want to say, if Iran was sincere, let's say the nuclear issue, and I'm not saying they're not sincere, but not only could you make some sacrifices around the nuclear issue, to make some compromises, to get access to the financial markets around the world, as Javad pointed out, to create jobs for young. Not many jobs have been created by this Iranian nuclear program. It's been a drain for whatever, 30 years. But you could also turn around and say to a country like UAE, you know what, you're working on a nuclear program, we're not working on a nuclear program, maybe we should share some information, build confidence along this big important issue like that. And finally, on the COVID-19, I say this, Dr. Ebtissam, if COVID-19 has a impact on Iran, it's indirect impact in the sense that this country, United States, will now be inward looking more so than it has in the last 3-4 years. Whole nation building is going to be top of the agenda. And that might create some space for Iran in the region, which means sort of front states, Israel, UAE, Saudi Arabia, others that have issues with Iran have to be relying more on themselves and less on the United States going forward. That could be the type of thing that could come out of a COVID-19 crisis.
Okay. Alex, again, I will ask you, and this is complicated question. Iran has built its political model on the revolution, state duality. The Iranian Revolution has adopted a narrative to build a nation based on the compound of religious nationalism. And it seems that Dr. Khalaji joined us.
I'm so sorry.
Dr. Khalaji.
I just finished with the live show on TV.
Okay.
I'm so embarrassed to complete the time.
Welcome to the webinar. So I'm going to ask you this question.
Yes.
Instead of Ali. Dr. Khalaji, Iran has built its political model on the revolution state duality. The Iranian Revolution has adopted a narrative to build a nation based on compound of religious nationalism, Iranian tendency, and Shia doctrine. So remarkably, the series of internal and external conflicts in which the Iranian regime was involved have deepened this model. So will there be a more extreme edition of this model in light of the consequences of American sanctions and coronavirus crisis?
Yes, I think what happened in especially in last 3 decades under the leadership of Ayatollah Khamenei, is a gradual transformation from a revolutionary government to a state of security in the name of religion. And what the leadership model that Ayatollah Khamenei had followed has created a situation in which the security apparatus and the military bodies of the country control everything from economy to culture and politics and so on. And unfortunately, the pandemic crisis has accelerated this process. So we see that IRGC has got involved in the areas that had not been involved before or had not been involved in this extent, especially in the field of the health system. So I think given the recent parliamentary election and also appointment of Mr. Ghalibaf as the Speaker of Majlis, we are going toward a more militarized and securitized government in Iran, especially when Ayatollah Khamenei leaves the scene. Because I think when Khamenei dies, we are not going to have a successor who has the same power and authority as Ayatollah Khamenei. But it would be a transformation of leadership from a personalist leadership to a corporate leadership. We are going to have a revolutionary guard behind the scene running the country, and that would be a totally different Islamic Republic, but unfortunately not better one.
Okay, so the duality will stay.
Yes.
All right, I have another question. Since you came late, I'll give you a bunch of questions. Since the implications of coronavirus crisis will amend and could change the distribution of power in the region, how will this reflect on Iran regional influence?
Look, when Revolutionary Guard wants to control the situation in Iran, they cannot only rely on force. So they have to convince people that we are the only authority who can provide you better security and even better economy. So they have to prove themselves to the people. This is what happened during the Syrian crisis, in which Qasem Soleimani has become a national hero because he was portrayed as someone who protected the country against a foreign enemy who was Daesh. I think if Revolutionary Guard is going to have more power inside Iran, they need to prove that the country is in danger. The country is facing threats from outside. So they have to, I mean, this is very likely scenario in which the Revolutionary Guard create some manageable crisis outside Iran in the region to prove itself inside Iran. So if they want to marginalize the civil politicians or the civil factions, if they want to suppress the civil society, they need to actually securitize the situation. They need to go toward a state of emergency. So this would be possible, especially if they create some problem outside Iran in the region. But they need to, I mean, this crisis could be created if they think that it's manageable. So, and they may do miscalculate. You know, it's not any guarantee that they would have a realistic evaluation about their capability and the situation in the region.
Thank you, Dr. Khalaji. I have a question for you and Dr. Saleh. And I will give you just a rest and start Dr. Saleh. How will the consequences of coronavirus and American economic sanctions affect the redistribution of power in Iran's political landscape? Dr. Saleh?
Yes, I'm not sure how the pandemic is going to do that. It's a very complex phenomenon, and we are just at the cusp of now a return of the pandemic on a wider scale in Iran. And, you know, there are, you find people who are pro economy as opposed to pro public health on both camps. Rouhani and the supreme leader agreed on the need to reopen the economy. It wasn't like one faction wanted one or the other. So I don't see how dealing with COVID is going to affect things, except, as I wrote in a piece for Foreign Affairs, the COVID pandemic has elevated the role of expertise in Iran society. You know, this, along the tensions between the development state and the revolutionary state, there is a similar tension between who is most useful, a person who is a strong believer, a committed Muslim, committed to the Islamic Revolution, Islamic Republic, or someone who has expertise. And at this time, the health workers, professional health workers across Iran are seen as the savior of the nation. The question, of course, is whether that will translate into political power for this middle class, educated middle class vis-a-vis the security state. I don't know the answer to that. But sanctions have had, for me at least, a more clear outcome. And the outcome has been to marginalize the moderate, marginalize the ones, the globalists who wanted interaction with the global economy, and create a more inward economy. Because that has so far been good for jobs, it hasn't created a lot of tension. And you know, there are middle class who like to travel to see their kids on clean airplanes to Europe and United States. They don't like this model, but they're not the majority of the population. There are a lot of Iranians who've never ridden an airplane, who don't have a relative or a son in abroad, and they are only interested in their young people having jobs. And if they can manage that, it's possible that the development state will come back, not in terms of giving people more social freedoms, but in terms of let's work with the global economy to the extent that we need it for creating jobs, so that we're not reliant on Chinese imports and bilateral trades, which are highly, highly inefficient.
Dr. Khalaji, your take?
Yes, with all due respect, I beg to differ with Dr. Salehi, because look, I agree with him that the sanctions have devastating impact on Iranian economy. And obviously the middle class, the business community don't like it, and it would do lots of harm to Iran's civil society. That's for sure. But this does not mean that in the absence of sanctions, we are going to have a strong civil society, and we are going to have a good business community, private sector, who is free to do trade with the world outside. No, we are facing a semi-totalitarian, authoritarian system. Even in the absence of all these sanctions and foreign pressure, they would continue to weaken the civil society. They would deprive the private sector from independence and freedom of action. And we should not forget the nature of this regime. The absence of sanctions does not change the nature of this regime. As long as Revolutionary Guard and Ayatollah Khamenei are in power and they have control over the country, they would continue to exert the same policies even without any pressure from West.
Thank you, Dr. Khalaji. Alex, as the coronavirus formed a strategic shock for the most of world countries, how will the fallout from this crisis affect Iran's relationship with its major friendly powers such as China and Russia?
You know, as I started saying, Dr. Ebtisam, I think the relationship there is complicated. Obviously, China is an important rising power. Certainly, it's in its own league. I mean, up until recently, it was standing for 1/3 of the overall trade for Iran. Something like, well, trade has dropped quite a bit. But by far the biggest trading partner. And that makes it stand out compared to Russia, which is an insignificant economic partner. It's a diplomatic and military partner. But as I said in my remarks earlier, the level of doubt about China in Iran, even within the Iranian regime, should not be underestimated. You know, the Iranians don't like the fact that they have put themselves in a position where they're being taken advantage of. So I think, you know, depending on who you talk to, I mean, this is the schism inside the regime that we talked about before. If you're talking to the Revolutionary Guards, they are probably more likely to want to advocate for closer, say, military ties with the likes of China or Russia. Will COVID-19 or the current economic crisis have an impact on that? I don't see it. I think you got to look, I mean, as Javad mentioned as well, it's very complicated. We don't know how this is going to play out. We do know that if there is another big shock to the Iranian healthcare system, if there's another spike, as there are reports coming out, then that's going to hit the Iranian consumption within Iran, never mind the trade with foreign powers. And that, again, to me, that suggests a trend towards nation building if they're smart in the Islamic Republic. They'll put the nation first, but we're not there yet. We're not there yet. But I will just say fundamentally on Russia and China, it looks much rosier on surface than it is in reality. There's a lot of suspicion on all sides about the relationship. What brings them together is the animosity of the United States and US hegemony in the Middle East, but that doesn't mean that you're looking at some kind of a close-knit partnership in the making. I don't see that.
All right. I will go now to the question from our viewers, and there is a question coming from Ambassador Asif Durrani, Senior Research Fellow, Islamabad Policy Research Institute in Pakistan. Dr. Khalaji, Americans have been working for regime change in Iran for the past 4 decades, but failed. Do you think that Mr. Trump's sanctions have made a difference in pressuring Iran to change its policies on twin American demands that Iran should negotiate its missile program and review its Middle East policy?
Look, I don't think that the regime change is possible by any efforts from the outside. I don't believe that the sanctions, even further sanctions, could necessarily lead to the change of regime in Tehran. But sanctions, despite all their negative impacts on the people's life, it had delayed the nuclear program, and it had delayed the other military programs that Iran has started a long time ago. Don't forget that Iran's nuclear program is one of the longest process of a nuclear program in the history of nuclear weapons, and we know that Iran in the past had intention to militarize this program, but they have given up. So all this has happened under pressure from outside. And even this failed nuclear agreement that has been signed under President Obama, it was signed because there was a pressure. So whether you want to stop Iran's nuclear program or you want to negotiate with Iran, history shows that you need to have some leverage, and sanctions has been part of this leverage, and to some extent they were successful.
There's a question, Dr. Salehi. Do you think that Iran will be weaker financially and politically if they pull from Iraq and other Arab countries?
I doubt it. Don't know exactly what is meant by pulling from Iraq.
I mean,
right now, I mean, that's their foreign policy. They see threats and they are doing their own resistance, trying to balance powers. It's a very complex game they're playing, and I'm no expert in that area. The relations with Iraq are now financially quite useful for Iran. And whether the political influence they have there helps them maintain those trade relations, I am not sure, because when you look at the Iraqi market, they like to buy Iranian stuff. They're very cheap. They're good quality. So if they were to choose between importing something from China or importing it from Iran, Iran can outbid the Chinese. Why? Because the labor costs in Iran, again, thanks to this economic pressure and devaluation, are lower than in China. So having some influence, as you know, it always helps trade because you can forestall tariffs against your goods. Recently, the border was closed with Iraq because of the penetration of the pandemic, and Iranians used their influence to get it partially open. I don't know if it's fully open now or not. So I would say there are some benefits to Iran economically from having influence in Iraq. So perhaps the simple answer to this question would be if they completely pulled out and had, meaning they had no influence, yes, that would not be good for their economy.
Alex, do you think that there is a, this is from Rewar Mohammed, is asking, do you think that we will see a different totally Iran after killing of Soleimani?
We haven't so far. It's been 6 months. And again, I mentioned this before. Ayatollah Khamenei said, well, this new majlis is Haj Qasem Soleimani's majlis. They even named him a new majlis that just took over last week after him. Ayatollah Khamenei is dedicated, at least in his words, he's dedicated to the legacy of Qasem Soleimani. And in a few words, what was the legacy of Qasem Soleimani? What was he representing? Well, he was the guy who for 23 years was the head of the external branch of the Revolutionary Guards. The people outside of Iran, you know, trying to export the revolution. In their words, they're doing forward defense, as they call it. They're providing security for Iran by getting to the enemy first in the region. This might make sense on paper as a military doctrine, but in reality, what we've discovered the last 10 years since the outbreak of the so-called Arab Spring, people in the region are not necessarily on board. So I hope that Iran will try and find a way to reassure itself. Because look, don't get me wrong, Dr. Ebtissam, Iran as a nation state has a right to be secure. It has a right to be able to defend itself like any country. I get that. Anybody who dismisses that is someone who I would disagree with. But you can look at how you secure yourself, your national security interest in different ways. I will propose to you the proxy model might be cheap. The proxy model might give you a lot of deniability. And you can do it by bringing Afghans or Pakistanis and others to Syria to do the fighting for you. But you are part of the fire that's going on in the Middle East. And what the region needs is to de-escalate. And one of the things Iran can do, not Iran alone, others can do the same, is to take a step back and reassess. And reassess with less money because of COVID-19, the drop in the price of oil, reassess collectively what can be done to reduce tensions. I think there are plenty of things that can be done. We hear it from leaders in UAE and elsewhere. You know, you can pick a place that's easier perhaps than others, but start the dialogue, start the conversation. But you know, final point, you cannot speak to each other over each other's heads. Iran cannot go out there, speak the language of revolution and Khomeinism when it knows that's exactly what the region or a good part of the region fears. you need to make adjustments along those lines in Tehran and probably elsewhere in the region. But that once you do that, hopefully the the path to dialogue will be opened up.
Thank you. Dr. Khalaji, may I ask you, do you think there will be a chance or opportunity for any deal between Iran and Trump if Trump got elected again?
I think it's possible. Yeah, the situation in Iran is not good. I think Iran is waiting for the election and they hope that Trump would not be elected. But I don't think that it would be easy because both parts have done lots of harm to each other and they don't have trust on each other. And I think Iran, at least in the first steps of such initiative, they are trying to keep everything secret. They are trying to do not publicize the negotiation like they did with Mr. Obama. So it would be difficult and it would take shape. It would have a completely different shape comparing to the previous experiences.
And if there is mediation from a third party, do you think it will work?
I don't know. It depends. I think Russia can play a good role in because they have Putin has a good relation with Mr. Trump, and Russia has been working with Iran. It's not Iran's ally per se, but they've been working in the last 40 years with each other. They had a very close relationship in the regional policies, especially in Syria. So I think Putin can be a good mediator, the strongest mediator that I can imagine to help this negotiation to happen. I think it's Russia.
I have a question for, this is the last question, sorry, for three of you. The duality between state and revolution. How long do you think it will stay? Dr. Khalaji, then Alex, then Dr. Salehi.
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
The duality, state visa revolution.
Mm-hmm.
You think for how long it will stay? And is it, and if it's still the IRGC controlling Iran, this will stay? Or if there is something changed, we will move to another stage?
You know, they say that the one who predicts the future is either a prophet or a lawyer. So I'm not neither one. But I think as long as Ayatollah Khamenei is alive, as long as he's in place, it's very difficult to imagine that he would let any such transformation like this to happen. After he dies, I think that would open the ground for lots of possibilities. And I don't see unlikely the Revolutionary Guard to somehow refashion itself and take the country toward a completely different direction as it happened in case of Soviet Union. But even if we go to, if Revolutionary Guard do such transformation, I don't think that it would not, perhaps it would be good for the world outside because, you know, they are going to be more nationalist. They would limit their agenda or their mandate to the within the borders. But I don't think necessarily it would help the democratization of the country.
Dr. Salehi, what do you think?
Actually, I'm in full agreement with Dr. Khalaji regarding the hazards of prediction. So I won't make a prediction, but I will say the following. I don't see Iran as a monolithic country run by a cabal that controls every aspect of life. I see a very strong middle class interested in normal life, the way life has been described, at least middle class life has been described around the world. And their wishes has the potential to get to stop this desire, if there is one, on the part of revolutionaries to control everything. Iran's economy is too complex for a few people sit there and run it. No country is run that these days successfully. And I think that, like maybe the generals in Latin America a long time ago, they decided that's not their job. They can't do it. You need a certain level of civil participation for a doctor to go to work, for an engineer, for a teacher, and so on. So I think people who see Iran as this caricature of a country with a government controlling everything don't think enough or don't give credit enough to the complexity of modern economies.
Thank you. Alex?
You know, I won't get into the complexities of modern economy of Iran, but I think it's pretty obvious that there's one voice that matters more than anybody else, and that voice belongs to Ayatollah Khamenei. So we can sit here and, you know, cut it and slice it and look at it different ways, but there is Ayatollah Khamenei, who's been in power since 1989, who we know in terms of his ideological preferences, where he stands, who we know is not accountable. He is God's man on this planet. He's not accountable to anyone. No parliament can remove him. No president can stand up to him. He has over 125,000 men in the Revolutionary Guards who will do his bidding for him at home and in the region. These are the facts of who runs Iran. I mean, to your question, or to the question about revolution versus the state, what happens next? It really, again, it's the choice of right now. If there's one individual who has to make that choice, it's Ayatollah Khamenei. Ayatollah Khamenei was a leftist of sorts. Among clerics, he was a leftist back in 1979. He became this, life made him into this right-wing hardliner. My point is, Dr. Ebtissam, people change. The world changes. We change our preferences. He could choose to go in a different direction if he wanted to. Problem, or the tragedy of Ayatollah Khamenei is he either doesn't like his own people, or he certainly doesn't trust their choices. He wants to drag them along on this journey, and so far he's managed to do so. But let's not kid ourselves. He's done it through force, not because he bought legitimacy. He has far less legitimacy than Khomeini ever had. Khomeini had a lot more legitimacy than Khamenei, but he has managed to create what Mehdi rightfully calls a security state. The guns, the prisons, and the intimidation has kept the place in together, but I'm just not sure how long this can continue. On this very not optimistic note, I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for this.
I'm sorry for, you know, messing up everything.
We do understand, Dr. Khalid, and hope next time to have you longer with us. Thank you all. Wonderful discussion, and accepting our invitation. And I believe our viewers really benefited from this webinar. Thanks a lot, and hope to see you again. Thank you.
Thank you.